أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. We were discussing different etiquettes and aadaab and ways and techniques to understand the Qur'an better. Just to summarize what we have spoken about so far, the first day we spoke about how do you honor the Qur'an and how do you bring it into our lives. And it has two aspects to it. One is showing outwardly respect to the Qur'an and honoring the book as it exists as a physical entity in different ways, showing it respect, kissing it, keeping it in a nice place. But more important than that, honoring Qur'an comes through having that respect for the Qur'an in the heart. And that only comes when a person has ma'arifah and understanding of what this book is. So we tried to speak about a few points that kind of remind us of what this book truly is. And of course I added a few practical suggestions because inshallah we want this discussion to have a practical impact in our lives. And so one of the ways to do that is to make sure that we all have a personal copy of the Qur'an. At times even you may want to have two copies. One, a pocket version that you can carry with yourself. It's there always with you. Of course you keep it respectfully and in a suitable way, but that doesn't mean you cannot carry a pocket copy. So it's very common in the hawza, especially if you're wearing something like this, to keep the Qur'an in your inner pocket, because this thing that we wear has many pockets, by the way. It has like two pockets here, two down. So you just keep it here, it's completely fine, it's not disrespectful. You can keep it in your bag, you can keep it in your purse, okay? As long as it's not seen something that's bringing down the value of the Qur'an. In fact, it's good to carry the Qur'an. Maybe that becomes a reason for us to go back to it and read it. So that was our first session. Then in the second session, we actually now came and we wanted to see how can we learn and understand the Qur'an. So there are two main things that were mentioned. The first was we have to come in the presence of the Qur'an as a true student, empty of any preconceptions. And that's not always easy because we are always loaded with ideas that we have learned. Some of them right, some of them wrong, some of them half complete, half-cooked ideas. So we have to try to shed that baggage in our mind, in our emotions, the cultural and social upbringing that we have had. We have to leave all that aside and come to Qur'an as a fresh page where you allow Qur'an to now write those meanings on your heart. And the second thing we discussed was, that this was yesterday, is that when you read a verse of the Holy Qur'an, you imagine yourself to be in that position. So if it's speaking about heaven, you imagine that inshallah I wish and you pray that I get those blessings. If it's speaking about hellfire and punishment, we remind ourselves that I do not want to be in that position. So you imagine yourself what would happen if you would end up in that situation. So now today we come to the actual etiquettes that we have. Again, etiquettes is a word that I'm using. You can use alternatives. You can even say techniques and ways and principles that allow us to understand the Qur'an. So inshallah today we will start speaking about them. I want to mention 4 things today quickly. But before I enter, there's one general thing about the Holy Qur'an and how you understand it, and that is that the tool that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us to understand the Qur'an is one thing, and that is intellect and aql. So only those people whose intellect and aql is sharp and functioning and they're using their aql well, they are able to truly benefit from the Holy Qur'an. And therefore, Qur'an constantly speaks about this idea of ulul albab. So ulul albab are people who can understand deeper meanings. Their intellect is very sharp. So if you want one universal tool which allows you to benefit a lot from the Qur'an, that's aql and intellect. And therefore we have very beautiful descriptions about aql in our narrations. I'm just going to read one of these. It says, Al-aqlu ma ubida bihir rahman waqtusiba bihil jinan. What is aql? Aql is that tool through which you worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Ubida bihir rahman waqtusiba bihil jinan. And aql is the tool through which you earn paradise. And of course, one of the strongest ways to worship Allah and earn paradise is through the Holy Qur'an and through coming to the Qur'an with a sharp intellect. So now someone might have this question, what does it mean to use intellect and aql when it comes to understanding the Holy Qur'an? Because it's a very general thing, right? How do I know if I'm using my aql and intellect? So in this context, I'm going to mention 4 techniques or aadaab that a person can use, that if someone has these qualities and these techniques, you can say that they're very smart. They are ulul albab, they are thinking and they're actually deriving benefit from the Qur'an. So the first amongst them is that if someone truly wants to understand the Qur'an, then he should be able to make connections between different concepts and ideas and topics and discussions in the Qur'an. Okay. In other words, we have this statement in our ahadith. So some of the ahadith, they mention this. But even if it's not there in our ahadith, it's a principle that the mufassirin use to understand the Qur'an, and it's called Al-Qur'an yufassiru ba'duhu ba'da. That in order to understand the Qur'an, the best place to go is back to Qur'an itself. In other words, Qur'an is like a jigsaw puzzle. It's not possible to fully understand meaning of the Qur'an by just looking at one verse. It distorts our understanding if I focus on one verse and I ignore the other teachings that we have from the Holy Qur'an. Okay. So normally what happens is that when you speak about a topic, one verse of the Qur'an gives you one aspect of that topic. But there are so many details and completions and fine-tuning of the meaning of that verse that comes in other places. So this is one of the things to realize, that when we read the Qur'an, then we have to be careful that we do not seal and complete everything by looking at this one verse and not allowing ourselves. So basically we have to keep the door open for Qur'an later to come and complete our understanding. And not only Qur'an, Hadith also serves as a tafsir, an explanation of the Qur'an. But of course, using hadith to explain the Qur'an is a bit complicated and technical, so usually you leave that to the ulama and scholars, and you just read how they understand it. Okay, so we go to tafsir. So for example, it happens a lot, so I want to give a few examples. There's a verse in the Qur'an that says, Ahallallahu al-bay wa harrama al-riba. It's a very simple verse. It says, Allah has made trading and business halal, and Allah has made interest forbidden. Riba is haram. Now when we read this verse, the meaning is very clear, that any kind of business transaction is allowed and any kind of riba is haram. Okay. But if you read this verse and don't leave the door open for a bit of explanation and conditions later on, you enter in trouble. Okay. For example, can you use this verse and say, because it says ahallallahu al-bay, buying and selling is halal, therefore buying and selling alcohol is also allowed? Can you use this verse to say that? Okay. So if someone were just focusing here and you take the meaning that's being said here without leaving the door open for exceptions, then you might have a wrong version. And we clearly know that yes, this verse tells us that buying and selling is haram, but there might be other places in Qur'an that tell us that buying and selling, for example, alcohol is haram, or hadith might come and tell you that. And it's very interesting, you always face this, because in our minds, riba is haram, right? And it's one of the greatest of sins to take interest. it's equated in the Holy Quran to waging a war against God. Right? Those who take riba, and we have ahadith that condemn riba like nothing else. But you might be surprised to discover that we have ahadith that tell us that riba between father and son is halal. La riba bayn al-walidi wal-walad. Okay, it's completely halal for father and son to take riba from each other. There's no harm. Or for example, when you tell people that, for example, the Maraje allowed taking interest and riba from non-Muslims, people are surprised. They say, this is against the Qur'an. So you say that, no, take it easy. By reciting one verse of the Qur'an, you cannot seal your understanding. You have to leave a bit of door open. Again, how do you make exceptions and how it's done? You leave that to the scholars. There's a procedure for doing it. We as normal people who are reading and we want to understand Qur'an well, we have to make sure that we see Qur'an as a jigsaw puzzle. We learn one part and then we leave the details for a later time, and you just say, I don't know. Okay, so you say, okay. Although this might raise this question, then how do we then benefit from the Qur'an if everything is not? So basically you read a verse and it's not closed, right? It's open-ended. It can change. The meaning can change. So the answer to that is, and this is the most important part of this point number one, and that is that whenever you read a verse of the Qur'an, even for us lay people who are not like gone to Hausa, we don't know those complex tools, whenever you read a verse, it has a core meaning that's absolutely certain. So you take that core meaning, the details you leave it for another time. Okay. So for example, I wanted to give examples to make it more tangible. So there's a verse in the Quran that says, وَمَنْ يَبْتَغِي غَيْرَ الْإِسْلَامِ دِينًا فَلَنْ يُقْبَلْ مِنْهُ. Whoever takes a religion other than Islam as their religion, Allah will never accept it. It's a very clear verse that tells us that Islam, and even more specifically, the Shia version of Islam, is the right path, and no other path is accepted in the eyes of Allah. This is very clear. فَمَنْ يَبْتَغِي غَيْرَ الْإِسْلَامِ دِينًا. Whoever seeks a religion other than Islam, فَلَنْ يُقْبَلْ. Lan in Arabic means never. Lam means not. Okay. So lan means never, like don't even think that there will be an exception to this. So it's very strong. So when you read this verse, you might come to this conclusion that, oh, that means that anyone who's not on the right path, like all the normal Sunni Muslims, the Christians, the Jews, so many other people, they're all going to go to hellfire, because the verse says, وَهُوَ فِي الْآخِرَةِ مِنَ الْخَاسِرِينَ. Such people would be amongst the losers in the hereafter. And who are the losers in the hereafter? Those who go to hellfire. They can't make it to paradise. So now, the core meaning in this verse is very clear, that Islam is the right path. But now, when you start speaking about details, like you ask this question, does this mean that there are no exceptions? What if someone was such that the right path did not reach him? Will they be excused? All these questions are open to discussion and deliberation. So what you do, you take the core message and the implications of this verse, you leave it open. You have to go and read other verses of the Qur'an to complete the understanding. So you use other verses to complete the understanding here, and you say that in other places Qur'an has said that those people who were mustad'afin, they were so weak in the land that they did not get the guidance and they did not have a way out. The verse of the Qur'an says, maybe Allah will forgive them and have mercy on them. Okay, so there's another verse that completes the meaning, but not in a way it negates the core meaning of this verse. So every verse, the core meaning is always preserved. You cannot go against it. And you try and understand the core meaning. The details, you leave it to reading tafsir, speaking to a scholar, doing a course on that topic to complete that understanding. So that's the first point that we have when it comes to using our intellect to understand the Qur'an. So one of the aadaab is to see Qur'an as one single whole where each part is completing each other. So the meaning can only be completed if you look at all the different verses on a single topic. So that's the first thing. The second point, or second adab, or second thing to realize is that not all verses in the Qur'an, although I shouldn't say it like this, but I'm going to say it like this, is that not all verses in the Qur'an are at the same level of clarity for us. Okay, so I've been very careful. Because on one hand we know Qur'an is a bayanun linnas. Okay? It's a book where there is no ambiguity. Allah did not send Qur'an in a way that it's ambiguous. But when we approach the Qur'an, we will definitely find, because of our ignorance, verses in the Qur'an that will be ambiguous. So you have this idea that Qur'an has verses which are muhkam and strong and firm, and you have verses in the Qur'an which are mutashabih, which are ambiguous. And this is that famous verse in the Qur'an that tells us about Qur'an. So this is Surah Al Imran, verse number 7. It says, هُوَ الَّذِي أَنزَلَ عَلَيْكَ الْكِتَابِ. And it is Allah who revealed unto you the book, speaking to the Prophet. Minhu ayatun muhkamat. Amongst the verses of the Qur'an are the muhkamat, the firm and the strong verses of the Qur'an. And it says, Hunna ummul kitab. They are the ummul kitab. They are the foundational principles. I'll explain what it means. Wa ukhara mutashabihat. But Qur'an also has verses which are ambiguous for us. When we read them, we will be confused. What does this really mean? Why? Because several meanings pop up in your mind. And it happens when you read the Holy Qur'an. Then it says that those people who have a disease in their heart, they use this mutashabihat to misguide people and everything. And it tells us that we should avoid misusing these mutashabihat. So again, I don't want to go into, Allama Tabatabai has a very long discussion about this verse. I think more than 15 pages just explaining this verse, because the later parts of the verse talk about ta'wil. Okay? And it says that there are only few people who know ta'wil. So that's a long discussion, maybe not relevant to our discussion. The point I'm trying to make is that Qur'an, certain verses of the Qur'an and certain meanings on the Qur'an are those foundational pillars of Islam, such that you can never go against them. These are those established verses and principles of Islam. You cannot touch them. Whatever you do, there is no way you can go against these muhkamat. So what you do is that if you see a verse in the Qur'an that's not making sense, or it's ambiguous and you're not sure what it means, you throw it back to these muhkamat and now try and understand the meaning. So you refer back the mutashabihat to muhkamat because they are the source. They are ummul kitab. So means mother, right? So mother is called mother, and it's called because the source of the child is the mother. So the foundation of a child is the mother. So these are foundational verses of the Quran. Again, they give examples to explain this. And again, this is a very simple example, but the example is given so we understand the idea. You can have much more complex examples where it might become a bit tricky. But simple. For example, verse in the Quran says, Ar-Rahmanu ala al-arsh istawa. Okay. Ar-Rahman means the merciful Lord. He sat on the throne. Now, you might be thinking, like, throne. Like, what kind of a throne will it be? Like, because throne is physical. Okay? So this is an example of mutashabihat. Again, a very trivial example, very simple. So how do you understand this? You go back to those muhkamat. So what is a muhkam verse that's going to allow us to understand this? Is the verse that says, لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ. So this idea that Allah is not like any other being. He's not like physical beings. He's not like other beings. He's unique. He's metaphysical, is a established principle in Islam, So now you have to refer back this thing to this verse and say that, oh, this doesn't mean Allah is physically sitting on a throne, it's a metaphor. Right? Throne and arsh doesn't mean, it has another meaning. So usually they say it means Allah's seat of power. Okay, again, not a seat in a physical way, it's the, again, whatever you do, you have to use physical words. It's the place or that reality from which Allah's power is channelized, that's the arsh. Okay. And you can take many other examples. Okay. So you might ask, how do we know which verses are muhkam and which are mutashabih? This itself is mutashabih, right? So we'll be like trapped. Like, how do I know this certain verse is muhkam, means it's an established principle, or no? Okay. So just to answer that, I just want to say that it has its own ways to do it, and this is not the time. I wouldn't be able to go into all the details. I'll give one example. If you want to find if a certain verse or idea in Qur'an is that established principle, you see if something repeats in the Qur'an continuously. Okay, so something, you have an idea that comes in the Qur'an 10 times. Okay. Naturally, you know that this is one of the established principles of Islam that you cannot change. So for example, something like Allah is just. Okay. Inna Allaha la yadhlimu mithqala dharratin. Okay. This is one of the verses. So probably you can find more than 10 verses in the Qur'an that tell us that God is just. So now that becomes one of the muhkamat. There can be no doubt. If you see something in the Qur'an that kind of goes against divine justice, you feel that, oh, why did Allah punish these people? They're really at fault. Okay. Naturally, it's leading a person to doubt divine justice. You trace it back to the muhkamat and say that, no, this action of Allah has to be absolutely just. I need to find out more what happened that they deserve this punishment. Okay, so that's how you match. Or just, again, examples. This idea, for example, that human beings have free will and they're responsible. This is one of the muhkama. Okay. So anything you read in the Qur'an that even mildly suggests that there is jabr and we don't have any free will is rejected. You have to now somehow understand the meaning of such verse in context of this idea of free will, because the idea that we are responsible repeats so much in the Qur'an that there's no way you can go against it. So in other words, if I summarize this point, Qur'an has a structure. Okay, there are muhkamat, those are like the pillars, and there are mutashabihat, which might be the details which we might need a bit more help to understand them. But whatever happens, those muhkamat are always our reference point for understanding the Qur'an. The last point, I had mentioned 4, but I'll just speak about 3 in a few minutes, and that is that all of what I mentioned so far is still at the level of understanding the Qur'an. Okay. And if someone does this, it's a big victory. They'll understand Qur'an precisely. But yet, it does not allow them to put it into practice. So you might have people who understand Qur'an, the theory of the Qur'an very well, but they might struggle to now pull that knowledge and bring it into their day-to-day life. And that is the idea of practical application. So the third point and the third aadaab and the third method is that we should learn different ways, which I'll speak about tomorrow. I just want to introduce this idea that Qur'an can truly be beneficial for a person where we learn the technique to somehow learn about these verses and bring them to our lives and make them applicable. Okay. And therefore, in the Holy Qur'an, Qur'an really praises those people who are able to make this connection between something that's theory and immediately convert it into something that has practical benefit for their own lives. Okay. So I'm just going to read one verse. It says, Alladina, this is a famous verse, we have heard this so many times. Alladina yadhkuruna Allaha qiyaman wa qu'udan wa ala junubihim. So there are those people who remember Allah in all the states. When they are sitting, when they are standing, when they are lying down, when they are sleeping, they are constantly in the state of dhikr. وَيَتَفَكَّرُونَ فِي خَلْقِ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ. And one of their qualities is that they think and they ponder in the heavens and the earth and Allah's signs. But it's not that they stop there. So their thinking doesn't just give them insight and the deep knowledge. They have some techniques, which we'll speak about tomorrow, that allows them to immediately see the impact of what they've learned in their daily lives. What happens? Immediately when they finish their tafakkur, this is what they say. رَبَّنَا مَا خَلَقْتَ هَذَا بَاطِلًا سُبْحَانَكَ فَقِنَا عَذَابَ النَّارِ. They can make it practical. So they see, they look at the heavens and the earth and they realize that this creation is not without a purpose, which means that I have to do something and I stand in the danger of going to hellfire. So Allah protect me. So somehow these people who are very smart people, these are ulul albab, they can take the verses of the Qur'an and they can somehow bring it into their lives. Okay? And that's the most important part. And this idea of benefiting from ilm and knowledge and bringing it into practical life, in the terminology of the Holy Quran, it's called hikmah, it's called wisdom. Okay, so wisdom, when you look at the Holy Quran, and that's why Luqman is called Al-Hakim, because he had this ability, this wonderful ability to transform theory into practice. So you see, all the instructions of Luqman are very practical. But that practical instruction is based on very deep understanding. So he had both. He had a deep understanding of verses of Allah, and he also had this ability to quickly take those and transform it into practical actions. Okay? And this is what I mentioned this, I think in my first session, is what you can say is making Qur'an speak to you. Okay, so this is a hadith. So it's a khutbah of Nahjul Balagha, very beautiful, where Amirul Mu'mineen explains how the Holy Prophet came and in what times. But in part of that, he speaks about Qur'an. So he says that the Qur'an was sent through the Holy Prophet. ذَلِكَ الْقُرْآنِ, and that is the book of Allah. فَاسْتَمْتِكُوهُ, make it speak to you. But it's very interesting. Amirul Mu'mineen says this, and then he says, وَلَن يَنْتِقْ, but it won't speak to you. So let me tell you, because basically he's trying to tell us that it's not easy to make Qur'an speak to you and give you those practical solutions. You need to have some techniques and some things. So here he says, make the Qur'an speak to you, وَلَن يَنْتِقْ, but it won't speak to you. وَلَكِنْ أُخْبِرُكُمْ عَنْ, but it won't speak to you. It has spoken to me, so let me inform you. Then he says, أَلَا إِنَّ فِيهِ إِلْمَ مَا يَأْتِي, and know this, that Qur'an has knowledge of what's going to come. وَالْحَدِيثَ عَنِ الْمَاضِي, it has the descriptions of what has come in the past. وَالدَّوَاءَ دَائِكُمْ, it has the medicine and solution for your problems. So this is what we want, right? We want to make Qur'an practical and learn how can I bring those meanings hidden in the Qur'an into my life. And then he says, وَنَظْمَ مَا بَيْنَكُمْ, not only it has solutions to your individual problems, even your social order. نَظْمَ مَا بَيْنَكُمْ includes government, society, culture. It has a way of organizing and giving it nazm and discipline. Okay? So inshallah we pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that we get this tawfiq to use our aql and intellect when we go to the Holy Quran. And inshallah, slowly and gradually, we are able to make these distinctions between muhkam, mutashabih. And our last session, we'll speak about now what are those, there are a few techniques and ways in which you can now, but it happens in two stages as I mentioned. First, you need to understand it well, the concept. It may not be immediately practical, but a lot of people miss out on that. They don't even understand